Of course, having written a poem only last Sunday about my father, in order to make sure that my mother didn't jump out of the ground and chase me.
Just in case they keep in school somewhere.
And believe me, this was my childhood, was maintaining balance of power.
That's right.
And I was, you know, I would get in the lighter scale to keep things even keeled. This, however, you gave me the this can't be beat, because this poem was inspired by Rena 2 weeks ago, because I was telling you the story about the bow ties.
Oh, yes.
And you may even have said you should write about this.
I did.
Let no one say I don't pay attention to you. This is called My Bow Ties.
Yes.
And you can't see it on the page, but what I have is, there are 2 lines, and then in tilted, and then a stretch that's different than the 2 lines. The 2 lines in each case are just descriptions of ties, and then there's some talk about them in between. My bow ties. Navy pin dot sprigs on pure white silk, bright and brighter stars on pitch blue black. Known for my hand-tied bow ties, I could go for weeks without repeating. People said they'd never seen such ties before. In fact, each one was handmade and unique. The group created by a mother and a son, one to envision, one to realize. A patch of melody along the staff, inverted through the knot against straw yellow. Expert with fabric, needle, shears, and thread, Mom could have executed any plan, but she had no idea what I'd wear. We'd look at bolts of cloth, and I'd imagine patterns with the weave or on the bias. Some cultivated silk too slick or thin would stretch and needed backing, stitched on first, then turned its outside in to swell the knotting. Ripe, tiny strawberries strewn on green cotton. Scattered black oak leaves stacked gray on gray. One piece whose pattern drifted lazily, I had her cut haphazardly. It made, depending on the side against the neck and end crossed over first, 4 different bows. She'd gone against her instincts, but admitted that trusting me was right. It was our best. Cross-hatched gold strokes engraved on midnight black. I choose according to my mood. Today, a box of crayons spills across my throat. Thank you. I was going to wear that. Each of these ties does exist, and I was going to wear the Crayola tie. I used to wear it to school every once in a while. My students always liked that. But I thought I would wear one that didn't make its place into the poem, and that's this one. So,
how old were you when this collaboration took place?
I was teaching. I was in my 30s and 40s. But you know, my mother wanted to, was nothing if not eternally relevant. So you know, you had to keep giving her ways to continue to be relevant. So,
Cooking wasn't enough.
well, you know, I lived 90 miles away, so she was very restricted in what she could do. And also, I hadn't lived at home since I was 14. And for many years in my adulthood, my mother would say, if only I'd had 4 more years to mold you. And I used to say, well, I think I came out pretty good.
But you could have been better.
Sending you off was one of the less fortunate things that she did.
It was a huge sacrifice on the part of my parents, but it happened because they valued education so highly that for me to go to Andover was a real privilege. And so I went as a scholarship student, and they had to scrape to pay what I was charged, which is just part of what others were charged. She hated like hell to let me out of the house, but that's what they thought about. And if you were to read, if you read through my book, there is a theme about education, because my mother's father went to school for one day as a young boy in Sicily and could never go back because they didn't have the 3 pennies that it took. So he was illiterate until the age of 40, and he taught himself to read and write Italian at the age of 40. My mother was learning it in grade school, and they learned together. They drilled pronunciation and vocabulary together. And thereafter, for the rest of his life, my grandfather was a very proud and a voracious reader. And he read the Italian papers all the time. There's still an Italian paper printed in Lawrence. He would read that cover to cover. He was very, very, very proud of his ability to read.
What was his trade?
He had been a shepherd in Sicily. He came to the States, and by the way, there are poems about all of that in here. Came to the States and worked at first in Brooklyn as a pin spotter in a bowling alley. Then he came to Haverhill and worked in shoe shops, which were the main industrial opportunity here in Haverhill. And then he was in an accident, and he was driving he had just learned to drive. And I haven't written about that, but he just learned to drive, and a storm came up and lightning struck the road right in front of the car he was driving. And he was very, very shaken by it, and his nerves were shot. And he really couldn't hold down any kind of steady work after that. My grandmother worked in the shoe shops, and that's how they got by. But he was very much a kind of a homespun philosopher, and I grew up. There's a long poem in here about my playing Sicilian card games with him that I love very much. It's a little too long for me to read, but it's in here. And he was alive until I was 21. I was very fortunate. And he was also a music lover and a musician. He had a little band that played at parties. So that's kind of the only evidence I have of musical talent in my family, because my mother couldn't really carry a tune, and my dad didn't do much musical, although he did own a mandolin when he was a teenager. And I never heard of anybody else being musical in my family, but I definitely got some of that from my grandfather. He was the first person to buy a gramophone in the Italian enclave, the people who lived on the hill. And he had Caruso records, and he listened to opera. So
I think with some cultures, things like that don't have to be in the family. They're in the culture itself.
yes, yes. So
Him being a shepherd explains that I so rarely hear the word shealing.
yes,
It was in the poem earlier.
I'll tell you what my grandfather did when I was a boy. He taught me how to take a length of clothesline, 6 feet long, and make a sling out of it, like the one that David used to kill Goliath. And he showed me, and you've seen it. And I made one when I was teaching. Every year I'd take my 10th grade students out into this field behind the building that we were in, and I would show how I could sling stones with this prehistoric weapon, twice as far as you could throw them. They just thought that was tremendous. That was only one of the things I got from my grandfather. So, okay.